Welcome, everyone, to week 6 of our last session of Faithful Conversations about the 1619 Project. It is a project born out of Faithful Conversations for Racial Justice, a project of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. I am Connie Ryan, Executive Director and moderator for this conversation. Thank you for joining us for each of the sessions to listen to some of Iowa's faith leaders on this subject. We hope you will allow today's conversation to inform and to challenge your own conversation. The goal of the New York Times, the 1619 Project, is to, quote, reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. And as the 1619 Project warns, quote, American history cannot be told truthfully without a clear vision of how inhuman and immoral the treatment of Black Americans has been. By acknowledging this shameful history, by trying hard to understand its powerful influence on the present, perhaps we can prepare ourselves for a more just future, end quote. The readings for week 6 include Mass Incarceration by Brian Stevenson, Hope by Geneva Aduam, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and Wadzane Mute. Shadow of the Past by Ann Bailey and Danielle Bowman. And then 2 other additional broadsheet pieces. One is Why Can't We Teach This by Nikita Stewart. And also another piece that was co-authored by Mary Elliott, Jasmine Hughes, and Erica Demon. You can find the links to all the readings through the New York Times or the Pulitzer Center websites or at faithful-voices.org. I am very pleased to have 3 of Iowa's faith leaders to be in conversation about the issues addressed in the readings today and to do so from their faith lens. Our faith leaders are Reverend Kimberly Abram Bryant, who is the former pastor at Bethel AME in Iowa City, Reverend Meg Wagner, who is the missioner for congregational development, communications, and reconciliation with the Episcopal Diocese of Iowa, and Sally Frank, who is a leader at Temple B'nai Jeshurun in Des Moines. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. And Reverend Wagner, I'm going to start with you and the question of what surprised you about the history in these readings?
Well, this week's readings didn't have a ton of surprises in it for me, but they all certainly touched on things that I only learned later in life, not things I learned in school or college for sure. I often feel these days like I'm in remedial history, always learning and relearning. And like the other week's readings before, those smaller personal stories, of course, that I didn't know, brought deeper and broader learnings to me. And I guess I wasn't surprised by, but I was pretty depressed by some of the numbers in the Why Can't We Teach This article about how many of our textbooks get a failing grade on the teaching of any of this history. That's it for me.
Yeah, and Reverend Bryant, how about you? What was a surprise for you in the readings?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I was surprised, but what I did feel is these readings were a little bit more affirming. I've read these articles several times, and as a Black American, knowing the history and have had this experience living through it, is knowing that, one, I was not taught everything at school. Most of the history that I know about my people have come from my home. And so there was a really deep connection for me when I was reading the stories of the law students finding out their history and about their families, and these beautiful stories about perseverance and how their ancestors contribute to this country, and also were the backbone of the democracy in which we talk about so much and we're so proud of here in the United States, knowing that we would not be the America that we are right now if it had not been for those ancestors. So it was really affirming for me.
Thank you. And Sally Frank, how about you? What was surprising in the readings?
I don't, like the others have said, I don't think it was so much surprising, but the detail was moving. and brought it home more. So that, I know that there were slave auctions, but that article about 450 people being sold at one time was really touching and brought it home in a way different from just knowing that there were slave auctions. And one of the things that just kind of interested me is I know growing up that there were adults when I was young whose grandparents had been slaves. And now reading about these law students, and I know about the ages of the law students and where they're coming from, but more generations have gone by. So now it's not their grandparents, but it's their great-great-grandparents, and they have never met them. But yet it still impacts them to know their story and know their history. That's not surprising to me, but it's very moving to me.
Yeah, and I should say you're also a professor of law at Drake University, and I did find those stories particularly interesting, and the details and learning. I'm sure as they learned about their own history, that was just kind of had to be a moving experience for them. So Kimberly, I'm going to go back to you, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit already, but the history that is laid out in a lot of these articles, and maybe specifically Brian Stevenson's article on mass incarceration, talk about the familiarity that you had with some of that history, whether it's that article or one of the other articles, and how does it fit with what you previously knew? Was it disjointed with what you previously knew, or did it align, I guess?
Oh, it totally aligned for me. Looking at mass incarceration and the numbers that we see of Black men and women that are incarcerated for crimes that we know that white males and females are not incarcerated at the same rate is very disturbing. And that practice still exists, right? And so we're still seeing young Black men enter into the criminal justice system at such large rates. And now when we look at incarceration, we have other entities and agencies and institutions that are helping with that mass incarceration. You have to consider the school to prison pipeline, right? Or when we look at the numbers of unemployment, if someone's unemployed, what are the chances of them thriving within a community, right? So they're going to need to figure out how to have the resources they need. And a lot of times that is a trap for incarceration, for just continuing to stay in the criminal justice system. When you look at where slavery is in itself an incarceration of people who were free, right? So they were enslaved human beings, and now this practice is just consistently been perpetuated in our country, and it is so deep within the fibers of our country and who we are that we have to be able to look at it in such greater depths than to say what we would like to do is just not to incarcerate more Black men and women, but we really have to get to the core, the fundamental issues. And when we're not able to confront the truths of what slavery has done to such a people as Black Americans, we will never get to the core issue of this justice system.
Thank you. And Sally, what would you add to that, of that idea of history, of what was familiar to you and what aligned, what didn't align, whether specifically to the Brian Stevenson article or to any of the others?
Well, in terms of the mass incarceration, that's something I've been doing a lot of reading about, well, beyond his article. And it's really at the root of what the BLM movement has been arguing, and the defunding of the police, to understand that our systems, the police were rooted in the slave catchers. That's what began police departments, and that the system of incarceration was a way to re-enslave people freed from slavery. And that gets you more towards the abolition movement. And the fact that we've had a period of great unemployment and great societal upset doesn't mean we need more law enforcement, even though crime is going up. Crime's going up because people don't have jobs. Crime's going up because people don't have hope. The answer isn't to put them in prison. The answer is to get them jobs, to get them hope, and to build other safety systems for them. The only social program that's really gone up since the 70s in major spending has been our imprisonment. We haven't put it in housing. We haven't put it in food. We haven't put it in children in daycare. What we've done, our biggest social program has been let's imprison people more and more. And that's got to stop. And see, his article and the other readings really show the roots of it. And when Kim talked about the school to prison pipeline, it's interesting to note that this year when the schools in Des Moines got rid of the school resource officers, arrests at Des Moines schools have gone down.
Yeah, a good example of how you can do things a different way. Meg, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, I'll stick with that article because it's certainly different than what I was taught and what I caught growing up. I'm going to give away my age here, but I was a child of the 80s. And every politician that I remember, running on a law and order platform, it was the war on drugs era, like all of the coded language and media images that I saw growing up has led to where we're at today too, right? That I only later came to understand is directly tied to those, to the things that go directly back to slavery that are meant to presume and reinforce those biases of with language and dehumanizing images that have been with this country since our founding. Without understanding this, I don't even know how we make sense of the disparities in the numbers. Thanks to the new Jim Crow and movies like 13th, I learned things that I hadn't been taught in school about the disparity in our sentencing populations. But it's only in the past couple of years that I've come to understand even how much worse Iowa is than our national average. That we're I think we're the 6th worst in the country in terms of sentencing of Black and Brown people. 4% they might make up 4% of the population, but they're 25% of our prison population. Those kind of numbers don't make sense unless you understand this history. And we can't do anything about them unless we address that history too.
Yeah, and I think one of the important pieces that Mr. Stevenson points out is that idea of criminality, and then also taking that a step further of tolerance for the brutality of punishment as well. Certainly back in slave days and then in Reconstruction, but then that also has led us into the present that we have laws that have created that idea. We have a history and we have laws that have created that idea that it's okay to treat people with this brutalness because they are more likely to be criminal, which we know is not true, but the system holds that up, as each of you were saying. I want to bring your faith into the conversation and that part of you that informs this conversation. In the readings, what would you say in what you're learning affirms or challenges or stretches your own personal faith or your faith tradition? And I'm going to go back to you, Meg, on this one first.
Sure. This week I kept returning to thinking about hope and justice primarily, but themes I found all the way through the 1619 project really, but returning to prophets like Micah, you have heard what is good and what does God require of you? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. But as a Christian, I find myself more and more having to wrestle between my faith and my faith tradition. The more I learn of this history, from the doctrine of discovery, which I think was mentioned in one of the broadsheets, where with the Pope, declaring God's blessing on invading and plundering and reducing people to perpetual servitude if they're not Christian, to all of the ways that's been woven through how this country was founded, all with theological machinations to somehow justify that, all of those things. That's the piece I wrestle with a lot. It's less about my faith and more about wrestling with my faith tradition. But of course, there have also been amazing witnesses and prophets within the Christian tradition, who fought for and spoken out against injustice. And I think at some I realized that's the place where I have to be if I'm going to stay in my faith tradition, if I'm going to continue to call myself a Christian, to keep calling my church and my faith tradition to be one that looks more and acts like Jesus, and gets away from anything that supports the structures of white supremacy or is aligned with empire or is nostalgic for some sort of good old days that, as this project clearly illustrates, has never been good for all God's people in this country. I was reminded recently that nostalgia used to be considered a mental illness, but a disease that keeps us from seeing the past and the present clearly, and I think keeps us from envisioning a better way. And I think Stevenson in that article said, we're at one of those critical moments where we have to decide between doubling down on romanticizing a past that never really existed, or look for something better. So that's where I found myself juggling this week in my faith and faith tradition. How do we envision that together a better way for all of us across faith traditions and across this country?
Thanks, Meg.
Yeah.
Sally, how about you? As you were reading and as you're learning in this, how does it affirm, stretch, or challenge your faith and your faith tradition?
Well, one of the things I'd noticed when the Pope was doing those encyclicals is around the same time of the Inquisition, when Jews were being killed, thrown out of Spain and being killed in Spain and burned at the stake in Spain and Portugal. But when I consider this, I begin with the very, the sixth day of creation, when God created us in God's image, B'Tselem Elohim. And that's the basic notion of the equality of all people, that we are all created in God's image, and that we have to treat each other, therefore, with this, bringing in the second creation story, as all people have the spark of the divine in them, as God breathed life into into Adam. So all people are created in God's image, have the spark of the divinity in them, and we have to remind ourselves of that when we encounter other people, that all people have goodness in them. And or as Brian Stevenson has said several times, even for people who've done despicable things, there's more to a person than the worst thing they ever did in their lives. Even they have the spark of the divine in them. In terms of kind of how I look at the history of slavery and things, what moves me and what I think is voices my activism is encompassed in the Passover Seder, that we approach the Seder as if I personally was a slave in Egypt and I personally was freed. And if I was a slave and I was freed, then I have an obligation to those who are still enslaved and who are still persecuted. And it's my job then to try to end other forms of persecution, including seeing in myself what may lend to persecution, and try to be aware of the subconscious biases so that I can actually overcome them.
Thank you. And Kim, how about you? What does what you were reading and learning affirm, stretch, or challenge your faith or your faith and your faith tradition?
Yeah, being an AME minister, we have such a deep, rich history of being a church that was birthed out of, a man, Richard Allen, who was a slave and bought his own freedom and established the church. But in that church, also our mission has always been the well-being of Black Americans, fit for their physical well-being, their mental well-being, and most importantly, their spiritual well-being, and making sure that the ministry advanced addressing those things, right? Making sure that those who were freed and not freed had education. So this was such a radical spiritual move, right? And so I believe that the church still has to be that radical, where I need to be the spiritual leader that allows young Black men and women and even older see themselves in those scriptures, to be able to see themselves when we talk about Jesus Christ, that the image of Jesus looks like them, making sure that they see themselves being liberated and supplied strength and courage and power and all of those things with through a God that created them and loved them. But although those scriptures were once used as weapons, but understanding now that these are the scriptures and we can teach them in a sense of which God wanted us to be able to understand them, and not understand them through a lens of oppression, but a lens of liberation and freedom. And so I think that's the great challenge of the church, right? Is that in this point, we have to be able to teach and to preach the truth and speak louder than what white supremacy has been able to do. And if the church, and that goes for all churches that profess to love Jesus Christ and he is their Lord and Savior, or whatever your religion may be, that you have to speak the truth to the scriptures. And I think that's so important. And churches all across America, if we can't do that, we won't be able to make much movement.
Thank you. I think that the article in the broadsheet that was about education and social studies kind of speaks to this also, in speaking the truth. And we know that there's been a lot of pushback in the public sphere around speaking the truth, and particularly in our public schools. And so your thoughts on that particular article, why it has been so hard to get folks to speak the truth and be okay with learning and exploring and understanding the truth of our nation's history, and kind of where do we go from now, both as faith leaders and also leaders in your own communities. How do we take the information and help our children to learn and to push back on the pushback that's happening in our communities? And I'm going to start with you, Kim, on that. Sorry.
No, don't apologize. Working in a high school, I'm a high school counselor, and working in the high school, this was a really disappointing year for many educators when we look at that House bill, and I think it's House Bill 802, and how it limits the teaching, or actually it puts more restraints on it, right? So you have more hoops to jump through to actually teach. And if you read that House bill, the problem with it is that it is the protection of the privileged, right? Which, if you look at what our teachers, our schools are made up of, we have more white female teachers in our school building, right? So it's the protection of the teacher and the majority of the students, to make sure that we do not have any bias towards them, make sure that we're protecting their feelings, making sure that we also don't call any of them privileged. So what we're saying is that the only people that can be uncomfortable in that classroom are Black and brown students, right? Like, we're willing to do that. And so when we look at also faith, we also have to address who are the most comfortable in our congregations and who are the most uncomfortable, right? So then if those who have been oppressed if we're willing to make sure that that population is the most uncomfortable and the oppressors are more comfortable, we got a problem. And so if we really want to address this, we have to be okay with being uncomfortable with truth, that we can't get beyond this. We can't repair our country. Our country, if you look at it compared to other countries around this planet, if we look at how racism and slavery has impacted us and how we're behind in universal health care, how we imprison more people in this country than in other countries, and we have more guns and we have more drugs. If we look at all of that and say, wow, this has really been the impact, right? So if that's the case, then we really need to allow those spaces to be able to be spaces of truth and be uncomfortable, because what can happen from there is that then we can address the real problem and we can move on. One of the things I know about my people, Black and brown people, Black Americans, is that we are a people of perseverance and we are a people who overcome. If we have allies who walk alongside us in that conversation and in the movement to restore or even to reconstruct, if we do that together, oh, we will be more than successful. But one thing we cannot do is walk with people who don't see the truth or want to lie about the past.
Thank you. Meg, do you want to follow that?
Well, amen to all
Yeah,
of that. Amen to all of that.
absolutely.
I think I'm at a point where I just know that the legislators that supported that bill know that the only way that any of this system changes is through education, right? I think they really got that that's the key. That it's going to take a well-educated populace that is no longer miseducated about their history, that knows that truth, knows the whole story of how we got here, to be able to undo it, right? All of this, you can't dismantle something if you can't see all of the structures that are holding it in place. And I think they got how dangerous that was. I think that's exactly why that bill is written the way it is. And I know there are creative teachers all over this state, still teaching the truth, finding ways to do that. I can't see any way through this for our country unless we go through it, right? Unless we talk about those uncomfortable truths, uncover them, the things that have been covered up, and name it and learn from it so we can do better. I don't know how we do that without. But I think that's exactly what that law was designed to prevent, and to slow down and to hinder it happening. And I know it'll happen anyway in all kinds of creative forums, because it can't not. This is the work of liberation for all of us.
I think it takes brave and curious and thoughtful voices, faithful voices to do all that. Sally, what would you add to all of that conversation, also as an educator?
Well, one of the things that struck me was that at one point that the Iowa legislature required freedom of speech training for the Iowa universities. At the same time, they required that the Iowa universities not teach the truth. So I'd love to, I'd like to be the fly on the wall hearing your students have freedom of speech, but you don't. And that's the message. You can't teach truth, but you have to treat other things fairly. I mean, it was absurd. I also actually taught that piece of legislation in one of my seminars and showed how much it did not accurately reflect anything. But what's the intent behind it is their own insecurity and their own fear of the truth. And I would like to think the United States is a strong enough country to reckon with its past, honestly, and to realize that by reckoning with its past, it can forge a better future. And the laws like this are really just showing that they don't have the same faith in the country that I do. And I think we need to teach truth in all ways we can. I'd recommend teachers look at the exact wording of the statute, and they'll find that there's a lot of things that, in fact, they can do. I'm not going to point it out here because I don't want to point it out to the legislators. But it's all our mission, in religious settings and in families and in schools, to teach what's the true history of this country.
Real quickly, I'm going to go around and ask you, in talking with your own faith communities, how can faith communities have an impact in the public discussion of these issues, all of the issues that the 1619 Project brings to light? And I'm going to start with Meg on that.
The first thing I'd say is by demonstrating your willingness and bravery to do that truth telling yourself. I'm part of a pretty predominantly white denomination that's trying to work hard at uncovering its own history and naming those truths. So you could set an example by uncovering your own history with race and showing that you can tell the truth about it and be stronger for it after.
Sally, how about you?
I think we need to look at our own implicit biases and work to overcome them and recognize them. Recognize also that not all Jews are white, although many people presume that, and to make sure that our congregations are welcoming and safe places for the Jews of color, and then take it out of the congregation and work to repair the world in actively combating racism and its effects.
Thank you. And Kim, how can faith communities have an impact?
Yeah, I think having ecumenical spaces where we can all share our histories, but also making sure that what we do leaves all of our four walls in our faith community, so that we can expand that message outside of Sunday, right? Or outside of whenever we have our religious teachings, that this is truly impacting the living of individuals, right? And that if we look at our faith and how people thrive within communities, that we as faith leaders need to pay attention to how the systems in our country really do impair folks from having their civil liberties and their freedoms within our country. We have to be the leaders of that conversation. If we serve, if we're in a religion, a faith that is liberating, then we also have to address where folks need to be liberated.
Thank you so much to all three of you, Reverend Kimberly Abram Bryant, Sally Frank, and Reverend Meg Wagner. I'm so grateful to each of you and for your thoughts, sharing your thoughts, and just a really good conversation. Thank you to all of our faith leaders over the past 6 sessions with Faithful Conversations about the 1619 Project. Your insights challenged us to think deeper into each of these subjects and into our own lives. Thank you to each of you who are watching. Your willingness to listen, learn, and engage in the conversation is critically important. Studying our nation's history with honesty and purpose is key to dismantling racism and addressing the impact of slavery, segregation, and discrimination on communities of color today. Learning is important, but we can't stop there. Taking action, both big and small, is also important. We challenge you to look at next steps and to take action to dismantle racism in your own community. Thank you so much to our team of faith leaders who designed Faithful Conversations about the 1619 Project and those who participate in Faithful Voices for Racial Justice. For now, if you have not already done so, please register to vote. And if you have, please help someone else register to vote. It matters in our democracy. Be well and take care.